Hi, this is Lil Fitz from Knock Once for Yes.
Before we begin the show, we wanted to let you know about a campaign we're taking part in called 2 Pods a Day. It aims to introduce podcast listeners to 2 independent podcasts every day for the month of August.
Taking part gives great visibility to indie podcasts like us, and who knows, you might just find your new favourite podcast.
To get involved, check out hashtag 2 Pods a Day, encouraging you to listen more, listen indie.
Hello? Is there anybody here? Can you hear me? If you can hear me, not once but yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to the July episode of Knock Once for Yes. If you're now on your summer holidays, I hope you're having a wonderful time, and I'm very jealous. If, like us, however, you have to work through the whole summer, we do hope this podcast makes your workday just a little bit easier.
And if you have been anywhere spooky for your summer holidays, then please don't forget to send us a paranormal postcard.
We would love that. So what have we got coming up on today's episode, Fitz?
Okay, on today's show, we have a couple of pings of the paranormal radar. We have some more stories from our listeners. We send you a paranormal postcard from the haunted abbey at Delapre on the anniversary of the Battle of Northampton. There's a newsworthy paranormal blooper, but first...
we have a very special shout out to Abby Siefka in Minnesota, who is a big fan of the show and the coolest 10-year-old on the planet.
Thank you for listening, Abby. I do believe that you're probably our youngest listener.
I wish we had podcasts like this when I was 10. I had to just make do with creeping around abandoned castles and pretending.
I remember having to stay up till sort of 11, 12 at night to listen to the creepy bits on the radio.
I don't think I was allowed to do that. We'd also like to thank our newest patrons, Els in London,
Hilary Fatino,
Karen Siefka,
and Mike Brown.
Thank you so much for helping us to improve the show and keep it running.
And on that note, we'd also like to thank some of our podcasting family for all the support they've given us.
Big thanks to the Pleasing Terrors and the History Goes Bump podcasts. And if you're not already subscribed to these shows, we love them, and we think you will too.
If you like spooky stories, creepy history, and tales of the macabre, go and find Pleasing Terrors and History Goes Bump and subscribe immediately.
Immediately.
That's an order. I mean it. Pause this now.
Right now.
Subscribe.
Go subscribe.
Then come back.
Have you done it? Okay, you can come back now.
Okay, on with the show.
So, I believe you have the first ping of the paranormal radar today, and I don't think I'm going to like it.
No. You're not a fan of clowns, are you?
No, if I haven't already made this quite clear, dear listeners, I have a mortal fear of clowns. I believe it's chlorophobia, is it called?
I can't remember, but I'm sure that this location will provide anyone with a phobia of clowns.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I would agree with that.
The infamous Clown Motel, once described as the scariest in America,
I'm not surprised.
is up for sale. Each room is filled with clowns. The lobby is filled with clowns.
Oh,
there are paintings of clowns.
no.
There are models of clowns.
Oh my god.
There are outfits.
Outfits?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, literally, the whole place is dedicated to the worship of clowns.
Oh, good lord.
And like I say, the building is up for sale.
And anybody thinking of buying it needs some sort of check on their sanity.
Well, do you know what? One of our Twitter followers got in touch to say, did you realise this was up for sale? And shall we club together and buy it?
Oh my god. No, I'm not going in a million miles of that place.
To be honest, it was a tight one. I was thinking, do I want to go back to work next week or should I go and run the Clown Motel? And personally, I went with Clown Motel.
Well, no, just I'm not coming with you.
You'll be glad to know that we couldn't quite scrape up the funds between us.
I am quite relieved.
Even with Noisy Spirit jumping in and attempting to help out, but between the three of us, we couldn't quite get there.
Well, thank you, Noisy Spirit, but I am off that boat. I am nowhere near. I am staying here at Coffee HQ. You can have the clowns to yourselves.
I don't know. I think if our listeners stumped up enough cash for us to buy the place, then you ought to come.
Listeners, please don't. No, please don't. It is meant to be quite notoriously haunted, though, isn't it?
It is. It was visited by the Ghost Adventures crew, if you've seen that episode. And as well as being thoroughly laced with clowns, there's actually a miners' cemetery just outside the back door as well.
Oh, awesome. Double whammy.
And if you were thinking, I'll just buy it and get rid of the clowns, the current owner wants to be able to come back and visit his collection of clowns. So I'm presuming there's some kind of clause in the sale that you're not allowed to change it.
No, he wants to go back and visit his clowns.
Yeah, he's going to nip off and retire and do whatever he wants to do and, take his grandkids fishing and whatnot. But he wants to be able to come back and visit his clowns.
Of course he does.
I would say to him, look, mate, just take your clowns with you.
Yeah.
But I don't know, if you've got a hotel's worth of clowns, where do you put them? It's not like if you move to a 2-bed semi, you can fit all these clowns in.
Oh, God. Well, other than stuffing them in the attic, and then imagine the terror every time you went up to get the Christmas decorations down.
I think I would just say, look, I've hurt my leg. Would you mind giving me a hand getting something out of the attic to anyone that visited to watch them leap backwards in terror?
Oh, God. Okay, yeah, I'm going to have nightmares for weeks. Can we move on? Away from the clowns now, please. And back to Naseby.
Yes, we go now from the horrors of the clown motel to the safety of a Civil War battle. You might remember last episode that we talked to you about the Battle of Naseby and some of the apparitions that are said to be seen there, as well as a couple of accounts from the 50s of a young gentleman and lady on a romantic picnic who happened to see some weary soldiers marching towards them. We decided that we were going to visit the battle site, and you may also remember that we'd missed the date because it was the 14th of June. However, we'd also discovered that the calendar had changed from that date and that the anniversary of the battle was now the 27th of June, so we hadn't missed it. We took the opportunity to travel out to the site, but while we were researching, we found another ghostly encounter related to the battle.
We did, as if the ghostly soldiers, phantom battle sounds, and a spectral replay of events in the skies over the battlefield weren't enough. We then discovered a story that Charles I was warned not to meet the Parliamentary Army by a ghost. Apparently, on the eve of the Battle of Naseby, the Royal Army stayed in Daventry, and the king found his accommodation at the Wheatsheaf Hotel on Sheep Street, which I believe is still there, so we may have to visit. But his evening reveries were disturbed by the ghostly visitation of his old friend, the Earl of Strafford. Now, this apparition appeared to the king not once but twice, pleading with him not to engage the Roundhead armies, and very nearly managed to convince the king to avoid the conflict. But unfortunately, Prince Rupert persuaded him otherwise, to disastrous effect, as by the end of the Battle of Naseby, the Royalist army was done for. So quite a potent warning then. I mean, appearing to him as a ghost twice on the eve of the battle, he really did not want him to go to war. He knew something.
Indeed, and I think, to be honest, if that had happened to me, it didn't matter who my friends were that were like, nah, go on, ignore that.
I think, personally, I'd be taking the advice of the ghost that had come to warn me specifically.
And we very nearly stayed away from the place ourselves because it was a rather drizzly evening.
It was.
But we braved the rain, and luckily by the time we got to the site, it was actually fairly clear.
And it is a very atmospheric place. If you do live locally, it is beautiful, and I would recommend that you go. I mean, we tend to think that we live in a rural area, but Naseby is very deep into English farmland. And to make it more atmospheric, we drove out there just as the daylight was starting to fade.
It isn't far from the main roads, but you do have to go through several back roads and village lanes to get to it. So I would suggest bringing a map as well as a sat-nav, because occasionally the sat-nav gets lost and doesn't know where you are, and it doesn't know the road names.
No, it told us we were on an unknown road at one point.
At least it knew we were on a road.
Well, yeah, it's true. But yeah, you do feel a little bit like you're driving out of time, or perhaps that's just my wild imagination. But when we got there, the site, I think the eeriness of it is amplified by the fact that it is so quiet. You wouldn't know that you weren't that far away from civilization. It was just deadly quiet. There was no traffic noise. There's nothing on the horizon but fields, the odd farmhouse scattered about in the landscape, and the only noise you can really hear is the far-off lowing of a cow in the distance.
Or cyclists.
Or cyclists, yeah. Actually, the sound travels for miles, interestingly, because people have picked up EVPs of battle sounds and cannon firing, and I was shocked how much the sound travels. There were a couple of cyclists coming down the road from us, and you could hear them way before you could see them, and they were only talking quietly. So the sound really carries in an odd way around that area.
Well, it's a bit of a valley, so it sort of encapsulates it all, I think.
I think it does. There's a monument there, and there's some information boards. And the thing that got me was when I was looking at the information boards, it was a bit shocking. It shows what the line of royalist troops would have looked like against the backdrop of the modern landscape. So looking forward from where you're standing at the viewing point, the whole skyline would have been filled with these royalist soldiers. And that's on foot and on horseback. And the total was actually 10,150. And I mean, I knew the numbers for an important battle like this were very high, but it really drove it home to me what that kind of number looked like. And it's just something that's very difficult to imagine.
Especially coming from seeing reenactors and watching TV programs
and movies,
where there are obviously not enough people to fill out the lines that you would expect. You know, we grew up watching Sharp on the telly, where it's supposed to be a battle of 20,000 people, and there's like 10 chaps and a guy on a horse.
Yeah,
you get used to thinking about battles like that, a very small number of people, but literally the whole skyline would have been filled with troops.
Now, apparently the detritus of battle was still being found in the fields well into the 1890s, and a farmer of the time reported discovering musket and pistol shot, broken swords eaten away with the decay of age, and helmets riddled with bullet marks. But that's not even the most grisly part. He also wrote of the disturbing snap of bones as he turned his harrow whilst ploughing the fields.
Luckily, we didn't encounter anything quite as disturbing.
No.
Or unluckily, I suppose, as we were going out to look for a spectral replay of the battle.
Very true.
Yes, we stayed for quite a while, and like I say, the weather wasn't the best, but the rain generally held off while we were there. And while it was a beautiful location, we did take our time taking in the sights. We didn't see any signs of the replay of the battle or spectral soldiers, but there was a kind of eerie feeling about the place.
I think it definitely had an atmosphere, and to be honest, with its history, I think that's understandable.
Yes, and I kept feeling like if I looked in the right direction at the right time, I'd see something. Like it wasn't like I actually saw anything out the corner of my eye. It was almost like my brain was suggesting that just outside the vision of my eye there was something, but it was just a really strange feeling. I've never really had that before.
No, you do find that in some locations. I think they have an air of something about to happen, if you know what I mean.
There was definitely a sort of tense feeling in the air.
But no ghostly soldiers, unfortunately. But hey, maybe next year we go back on the 14th of June, even though that's not technically the correct date, and see if anything happens then.
We should do both.
We should do both, yes.
We should do an Ashley Nibb style experiment.
We should. Let's do that. That sounds exciting. Well, now to our first story of the episode, and rather wonderfully, our listener has sent in a story about a haunted battlefield. How perfect is that? So this is from Hillary in Massachusetts. It was during the heat of the summer in May of 2015 that my girlfriend and I decided to go out to the battle road that runs through Lexington and Concord. We started at the visitor centre and started walking towards Concord, taking the path that the battle took. It was during the height of the tourism season, so we saw British and American flags marking the sites where there had been fatalities during the fighting. There's also a tavern along the route from the Revolutionary period, and it was when we were passing this that things went from quiet to unusual. Several times during our walk, we'd been overtaken by joggers, and we'd gotten used to the sound of someone coming up behind us. So when it happened again, we stepped off the path by the tavern sign and stone wall and waited to let whoever was there pass us. But there was no one there. We looked all around for anything that could have caused the sound, but there was nothing. The path is gravel and quite straight for a distance. No one was there. The tavern was closed for the day, and there weren't even staff present. To this day, we don't know what we heard, but if it was a ghost, they would have been running towards Concord, the same direction the soldiers had marched. Well, that was exactly the sort of thing we were hoping would happen to us at Naseby.
And unfortunately, it was exactly the sort of thing that didn't happen to us at Naseby.
Unfortunately, yes.
Well, thank you to Hilary for sending in that story. That was definitely an interesting one. And you wouldn't mistake the sound of footsteps on gravel, would you?
No, I mean, it's a very recognisable sound. And she talks about the path being quite an open stretch. So I imagine you'd be able to see anybody that was coming on the path and making gravel crunching footsteps.
Certainly you'd be able to see them if they were in earshot.
Definitely.
It raises another point, actually, that I found quite interesting as to whether... Because she mentions the fact that there's British and American flags.
Yeah.
So I presume, therefore, that this was the War of Independence.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder whether having somebody there with a British accent might trigger some kind of activity.
That's an interesting thought, actually. Yeah, I wonder whether having somebody there like us would stir anything up.
Be worth investigating. I think we may have to put that on our paranormal postcard adventure list.
I think that has to go on top of the wish list. Yeah, let's do that.
And thanks again to Hilary for that story. We take you now from Massachusetts to Rome via London. Victoria, an American student currently studying for her master's degree in archaeology in London, brings us her story from Rome.
When I was 16, I spent a week in Rome on holiday with my mum. I've always been interested in archaeology, so we made an effort to seek out more unusual and lesser known attractions, especially archaeological sites of particular importance. Of course, this is quite easy to do in a city like Rome. We did all the normal things, like the Colosseum and the Vatican, but we also spent an afternoon in the Basilica of San Clemente al Laterano, a Catholic church constructed in approximately 1100 AD. The church itself was the standard old church. High ceilings, mosaics, stained glass. What makes this church unique and what drew us to it is that it sits atop a 4th century Catholic church, on top of a Mithraic temple, on top of a Roman villa. It's actually possible to go underneath the modern church and see the archaeological remains of the earlier occupations. For a budding archaeologist, this seemed like the dream site. The archaeological layers are visible as a sort of basement under the 12th century basilica. It's unpaved and unfinished, quite chilly, with stone walls, floors, and low ceilings. It's lit well enough not to bump into things, but still very dark and shadowy. The main space was divided into 2 large rooms, primarily the 4th century church and the Mithraeum, with the earlier Roman home visible at the far end of the space. The Roman villa was more substantial, with the original walls and hallways still standing. There were doorways that didn't lead anywhere, and spiral staircases that led up into solid stone wall. This labyrinthine space was even darker and more shadowed, and echoed with the loud sound of running water, as the Roman occupants rerouted a small river through channels under the floor to provide clean water for the house. I consider myself a pretty brave person. I've camped in a tent on the Serengeti Plain. I've climbed down into the Grand Canyon. And I'm pleased to report that my biggest fear is the completely illogical velociraptors Thank you, Jurassic Park. I've spent countless hours in dark, enclosed archaeological spaces, even surrounded by human remains. But as I stepped into the lower levels of San Clemente, I just felt an overwhelming sense of dread. There was just something wrong in that site. We spent maybe an hour there, and the entire time I felt there were people moving just out of sight, watching me from the shadows. There were a few other tourists in the site with us, but they were primarily older people, doddering round in the well-lit space near the stairs. My heart raced the entire time as I walked around and read the information plaques and looked at the archaeology. Feeling like I was being silly and that I couldn't miss the opportunity to explore such a unique site, I walked through the rooms of the Roman home. At one point, I was standing in a doorway, looking into a reasonably sized room, from which the sound of water came. Across the room, in a corner, there was a place where the floor had caved into the water channel beneath, meaning you could watch the water running past. The room echoed with the sound, and the way it reverberated around the maze-like stone walls was extremely creepy. My mum found me standing here staring into the room, and once she was there, I felt obligated to be brave and enter the room. I walked over to the water channel and looked down into the dark hole. I was absolutely sure that I was going to see something terrible. Never in my life have I ever been as tense and on edge as I was in that room. The water was only about 30 centimetres down and was obviously a relatively strong river, although quite small. Nothing terrible. But the innocent river didn't really reassure me, and I left the room walking backwards, sure that if I turned my back on the channel, something would reach out from it and grab me. After about an hour, my mum and I returned to the street, where a pleasantly warm sunset was starting. As soon as I stepped out of the basilica, I felt completely fine again. Talking to my mum over dinner about the sites we had visited that day, I mentioned that I did not really like San Clemente, and that I had felt a horrible sense of dread the whole time we were there. I said I only stayed so long and pretended to be okay, because I thought that she was enjoying the visit and was interested in seeing the archaeology, and I didn't want to ruin it for her or drag her out early. My mum stared at me when I finished talking, her fork halfway to her mouth, and she said that she had felt an engulfing terror in the sight too, and had desperately wanted to leave as well. She had thought that I was interested and having a good time, so she stuck it out for me. She then told me that her instinct was to grab me and pull me back away from the water channel in the Roman room, because she was sure that if I looked into the hole, something horrible would happen to me. If it had just been me that was so unnerved by the space, I might have been able to logic away the overwhelming dread I felt there. But my mum's similar experience absolutely convinced me that there is something horribly wrong with this place. This was in 2010, and to this day, my mum and I have difficulty talking about the experience. We've also found that no matter how far apart we are, even on different continents at times, if one of us is reminded of San Clemente, then the other one will be too. If I came across a book about the site in the school library, then my mum stumbles across the rosary she bought there in the bottom of a drawer. If my mum was telling a friend about our holiday and mentioned the basilica to them, then I would find the ticket to the site laying on my desk, even though it's kept between pages of a journal that I never opened. I can't explain the overwhelming terror I felt in the Basilica of San Clemente, but nothing could ever convince me more of paranormal occurrences than such a strong and visceral personal experience. Thank you to Victoria for sending in that fascinating story, although I do have to apologise that I just cannot say mom in an American accent. My Britishness will simply not allow it. It just comes out sounding like the Kurgan from Highlander.
Mom!
Exactly like that. So apologies to Victoria and another listener later in this episode that it's just going to come out as mum. I'm very sorry.
I must say that I've had that feeling of just bizarre, unfounded terror before.
Yeah, so have I.
I'm bearing in mind that part of my job is to wander around abandoned buildings. I had one that was an elderly people's home in one of the towns that I look after. And every time I went, the minute I stepped through the doors, I was constantly on edge. You know, admittedly, there were things that happened in the building.
Yeah.
There was slamming doors and I saw shadows and various other things. But even when I went to the building and things like that didn't happen, I just had that terror constantly. I hated locking up that building at night. Yeah, there are some buildings and I've got some old sort of Victorian schools and things like that, and you'd have thought wandering around those in the dark at night locking up would be pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
But no, I'm fine. Yeah, just walk through and it's not a problem. But this one building, it's quite modern as well.
Yeah.
It had recently been refurbed because they were using it as a doctor's surgery before it came to me. So it wasn't sort of terrifying inside. It wasn't like the wallpaper was peeling off and stuff. It was all modern and well lit, and the electricity was on and it was all fine. It was just
so there's just no reason for it.
No,
I have one as well. The worst time was when I visited Chillingham Castle, and it's just as she described. I mean, I have to say Chillingham is well known for its hauntings, but I didn't know that at the time I went. I was quite young. This was years and years ago. So I wasn't aware of the ghost stories and the hauntings. This was before the internet. It's not like they had signs up saying this place is haunted. And I just, from the second I walked in there, it felt like there was something just wrong. The whole place freaked me out. It was fascinating and I should have loved it, but I was just freaked out. I was too freaked out to enjoy it the whole time I was there. I just wanted to leave. It was oppressive. It was heavy. It felt like there was something watching you. And my mum will tell you, actually, that I left quite an expensive pair of sunglasses in the toilets there. And we realised when we got back to the car, so it wasn't very far to go back and get them, but I just flatly refused. I was like, nope, just leave them. I don't care. I'm not going back in there in a million years. And there's just no reason for it.
Man, that must have scared you. I know you wouldn't leave an expensive pair of sunglasses behind without good reason.
No. And generally, I like creepy buildings, so this truly did freak me out.
Wow.
Well, our next listener story takes us to Wichita, Kansas, and it's a rather poignant one from Mary Ann. In 2005, I was a respiratory therapist living in Wichita, Kansas. Due to their declining health, my parents lived with me. We had a wonderful relationship. We played games, watched movies, and had long conversations about every topic conceivable. They really had become more friends than parents. In the last half of 2004, I noticed my dad's health was declining even further. I went to physician's appointments with him and tried to raise concerns, but I was ignored. About the same time, a connection I only made in hindsight, there were strange things beginning to happen in the house. Although we all slept in different rooms, my parents had not slept together for years because of my father's sleep apnea. We all began to experience the same thing. In the night, we would feel someone sitting on the foot of our beds, only to look and see nothing there. My mum's door was right next to mine, and she would see a figure in white walk from my room into my dad's. Finally, in February of 2005, frustrated with his physicians, I took him to my own. Long story short, he was diagnosed with end-stage lung cancer, and he was set up with home hospice services. We were told he had about 6 to 8 months. At the time, I was working second shift in a busy level 1 trauma centre, so I normally got home around midnight. They would usually wait up for me and hear about my night while we had a snack before bed. About 1:30 a.m, we went to our rooms. I'd just laid down and pulled my quilt up. I was flipping through the channels to find something to watch, and I'd not even taken my glasses off yet. Then, for reasons I still can't explain, my attention was drawn to the hall. I saw a tall black form there. My brain was rebelling against what it was seeing. The hall was dimly lit, not dark though. The form was solid black, vaguely human-shaped. So I leaned upon my elbow and said, "Daddy, are you okay?" No answer. "Daddy, do you need something?" Again, no answer. Then the top part of the form turned towards me. I've always been sensitive to spirits, but this was the most profound experience of my life. I got the impression that he, yes, the entity felt male, was trying to project a human face into my mind. It almost made me giggle because I had the craziest feeling that if I showed any fear, I would hurt his feelings. In truth, all I saw was a shift in the top of the black mass. I was not afraid. I felt no evil or anything negative. All I felt was pure, unmitigated determination, as if he was saying, "I'm here to get him. His time is short." He lived only about 2 more weeks. In total, almost 6 weeks to the day from diagnosis. I know most stories about shadow people are dark, but I believe what I saw was an angel of death. I wondered why I was allowed to see him. I'm Catholic, and I believe God allowed me to see him as a way of preparing me, because he would live nowhere near the expected time frame. You see, I hate surprises, good or bad. When the end came, it was peaceful and painless. It was also an end to the white figure that my mum saw, and we never again felt anything sit on the foot of our beds. I felt my dad with me all the time until my mum died. Now, I feel they're both at peace. Thank you so much, Marianne, for sharing such a personal and moving story with us. It was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. And it is interesting what you say, because you're right. Shadow figures, ordinarily you will find that they crop up in negative circumstances. So it's quite unusual to find them in this kind of a positive light.
Yeah, I was interested in the fact that she felt it was trying to project a face, presumably so that it appeared less threatening or
in a sort of a sense of familiarity, perhaps.
And it was, obviously quite touching that she felt that she'd got some form of warning and reassurance from it.
Our next story also has a comforting visitation from a family member, but also something possibly a bit more sinister. This is from Julie in Dallas, Texas. I've experienced a number of paranormal oddities in my life, but I'm going to tell you about a few that have happened in the last few years. I've been living in the same townhouse for about 16 years now. It was built in the 1970s, and as far as I know, nobody died there. I live alone in this 2-story house, and for the most part, nothing spooky ever happened there. Until about 4 years ago. One night, I woke up from a deep sleep to the sound of someone sobbing loudly next to me in bed. I didn't immediately open my eyes as I tried to process what I was hearing, but I could hear the loud crying, and I remember thinking, this can't be real, because it sounds like someone is crying right next to me in bed. I slowly opened my eyes, afraid of what I might see. But when I opened my eyes, nobody was there and everything went silent. I breathed a sigh of relief and closed my eyes to go back to sleep, only to hear the loud sobbing again. This time I was even more afraid to look, but I opened my eyes and nobody was there. I rolled over on my back trying to shake it off and process what had happened, when all of a sudden I felt a hand grip my ankle and yank my foot towards the end of the bed. I immediately pulled up my feet and started to say a prayer of protection and demanded whatever was there to leave me alone in Jesus' name. And nothing more happened that night. A couple of years later, and shortly after one of my grandmas had passed away in Florida, I was lying in bed but not yet asleep. I'd only just gotten in bed a few minutes before when I felt someone sit down on the edge of the bed by my feet. I could feel the bed sink in, and although this creeped me out, I wasn't terrified. I assumed maybe my grandma had stopped in to check on me, or at least I hope it was as sweet and innocent as that. Again, I said a prayer of protection over me, just in case. I've had a few more weird incidents in the last few months. One night, I turned on the light switch in the kitchen, but the light bulb flashed and died. I went to get another bulb and attempted to change the bulb in the chandelier, but it was in an awkward position and I couldn't see well. I remember thinking, I sure could use some light. And at that moment, the light on my china cabinet suddenly flew on. The light in the cabinet is touch sensitive and has to be touched from the inside to come on. I remember saying, "Thank you," out loud, because someone had helped me out just when I'd needed it. I like thinking it was my other grandma, who had once given me a lamp and told me, everyone needs a little light. I often repeat this quote of hers and remember her little lamp gift fondly. A few weeks later, I was going into the kitchen and thought I'd heat up a frozen burrito for dinner. I opened the freezer and a burrito just falls out onto the floor. There was no reason for this to happen, as the burritos were securely in the freezer and it wasn't overstuffed or anything. I'm sure I've had other little things like this happen over the years in this home, but these are just the most recent events.
So, thank you to Julie for sending in that story. It certainly sounds like you've got an interesting mix of positive and negative things going on in your house.
Yeah, it does, and I must admit I'm kind of a little bit jealous about the automatically dispensing burrito freezer.
Yes, I must admit it would be very nice if you could just bimble around the house and you've got something. Well, you look hungry. Have a burrito.
I'll even turn the light on for you.
Yeah, I could do with that at night. The amount I bump into things in the middle of the night, I could really do with somebody to just flick the light on for me.
Well, I think that was quite sweet as well. There's the very obvious connection there between the lamp that her grandma had previously gifted her and the saying of hers that everybody needs a little light, and then that light coming on, which is inside a cabinet. And it needs to be touched from the inside to come on. So it's not just going to pop on by itself. It almost seems to me like something saying, if you remember these things about me, this thing that we had, this lamp that I gave you, this is sort of a sign that this is me.
Yeah, it certainly seemed targeted. You'd have thought if it was something else that was doing it intentionally, it'd just flick a room light on. Interesting. I must admit, I wouldn't have had the fortitude that she had dealing with something grabbing my ankle in the middle of the night, though.
Oh my goodness, I would have flown out of that room screaming.
Especially after hearing something crying next to you. There is something about the sound of crying that just sets you on edge.
It's very, very creepy. And yeah, kudos for having the presence of mind to just tell it to leave you alone, which sounds like it may have worked because it doesn't seem to have bothered her again. And yes, it sounds really sinister on the surface, doesn't it? Hearing this sobbing sound and then having something grab your ankle and tug on your leg. But if you think of it from the other perspective, whatever this thing was crying, it was sobbing. So was it really trying to hurt her and scare her, or was it just trying to get attention?
Yeah, it's odd. It's not the sort of thing somebody that's being aggressive would generally do.
No. But it is absolutely terrifying to hear in the middle of the night.
Oh, definitely. And I'm also interested in the fact that, it's a reasonably new house, because we had something similar at the place I sort of grew up in my younger to teenage years. Again, the house was built in the 70s. It was built outside the village boundary, so there was no house there before. We knew the people that had sold it. Nobody had died. There's nothing major gone on there. And yet we had a reasonable amount of activity, and it sounds like there's a similar thing going on here. I'm just intrigued to know.
Yeah, and I think we've heard that a few times now. It doesn't seem to make any difference whether you always think of these haunted houses being historic places, and they're not necessarily. We've had quite a few stories in from people who live in modern houses, and there doesn't seem to be any history there. And I don't know where that connection comes from.
Certainly worthy of further investigation, I think.
I think so, yeah. Thank you so much to everybody that sent in stories for this episode. We absolutely love hearing your stories. They're utterly fascinating. And the sharing of stories really is what makes this podcast what it is. They really are an integral part of the show. So if you have a story to share with us, please consider sending it in.
There are various ways you can do so, including via email. You can record yourself on a cell phone or PC and send us the audio file. You can call us on our telephone number. And all the information you will need to send in these stories is found on our website at www.knockOnceForYes.com, and just navigate to the Send Us Your Stories page. And we move on now from Dallas to Delapre.
Yes, for our latest paranormal postcards adventure, we went out to Delapre Abbey, site of a former medieval nunnery rather well known for its Grey Lady haunting, but also the site of the Battle of Northampton. And the day we went out there was during a special event to mark the anniversary of the Battle of Northampton that took place on the site in the year 1460.
Because, as well as having an interest in the paranormal, we do enjoy going out on a Saturday afternoon and watching people dress up and pretend to kill each other with swords.
Yes, we do. We are both, in fact, big old history nerds. And what more could you want from your Saturday afternoon than a show of cannon fire?
Indeed, you gotta love things that go boom.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, things that go boom is part of the reason the Battle of Northampton is so interesting. It marked the first use of artillery in England. The battle itself took place in 1460 during the War of the Roses between the Yorkists and Lancastrians, who were two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet. The battle was also famous for the capture of then King Henry VI by Archer Henry Mountfort following the treachery of Lord Grey of Ruthin. Lord Grey, in exchange for support in a property dispute with a Lord Fanhope, had his men lay down their weapons and allow the Yorkists access to the Lancastrian camp. His action sealed the fate of the Lancastrians, who were overcome in 30 minutes as they were unable to manoeuvre within their fortification to counter the attack. Only 300 Lancastrians were slain in the battle, with the Yorkist leader, the Earl of Warwick, ordering his troops not to lay hands on ordinary soldiers, especially those belonging to Lord Grey. The king was then escorted, with respect, first to Delapre Abbey, then Northampton, and finally London, leading to the surrender of the Tower garrison.
So quite an important battle in the War of the Roses, really. And as you can imagine, that with a battle such as this taking place in the grounds, some visitors have reported seeing ghostly soldiers on their way to battle. But actually, the more frequent sightings are that of the famous Grey Lady of Delapre. This forlorn-looking apparition has been seen sadly crossing the landing inside the house or silently descending the stairs. Wearing robes described as a grey or sometimes blue colour, she is traditionally believed to be a nun who likely lived here during the time that the abbey was home to the Cluniac nunnery of Saint-Marie de le Pré, which means St Mary of the Meadow, between 1145 and 1538. And please do excuse my terrible French accent.
I thought that was really good.
Well, thank you. Some people have merely encountered her as an inexplicable chill passing through the room, including the niece of a former owner of the abbey who was visiting one day. Sitting in the library, she felt a chill breeze in the room that startled both her and her dogs to attention. The chill passed, but her dog's hair was standing on end and they began to bark at the invisible intruder. One resident who rented an apartment within the abbey cut her tenancy short because she became so disturbed by the apparition of a woman that kept appearing on the first floor. And yet others have reported strange lights on the staircase where the ghostly nun has often been sighted. Oh, that's not what you want to see when you go upstairs to your rented apartment, is it? The ghost of a nun.
Nuns are pretty scary at any time, to be honest.
Yeah, especially if you watch too many of the Conjuring films. So after the dissolution of the monasteries, the nuns were effectively kicked out and forced to go and live with any family who would take them in. And unfortunately, these days, no remains of the original medieval building can be seen. And what you can see left standing today, I mean, it's a glorious building, but when you start looking around, it's a bit of a hodgepodge. You can see where all the different wings have been added on, but the frontage is still magnificent.
So when you said that the original building can't be seen anymore, was that the nunnery itself? Yeah,
the nunnery. It's the medieval building that was originally founded in 1145, but the foundations are there.
So it's interesting that people see a nun climbing the stairs when the stairs wouldn't have been there when it was a nunnery.
No, but then we don't know whereabouts different bits of the nunnery would have existed within today's structure, if you know what I mean. It's like when you hear those stories about, apparitions that walk sort of with their knees through the floor, so they're following a path of a different building. They just happen to be appearing in a place that is still within the current building, if you know what I mean.
It seems pretty strange that they would perfectly align with the new building.
Well, I mean, it may not be a nun. The abbey itself has seen some interesting times, and people, I think, are attributing the robe-like appearance to being a nun simply because of the clothing. But really, I mean, this has had a very long history. When you think that there's been a building standing there since the 1100s, it really could be any character from the estate's history, couldn't it?
Yes, Delapre's certainly seen its fair share of colourful characters throughout the ages. And as if ghostly nuns and soldiers wasn't enough for you, there's even a spectral Labrador that prowls the area. It's believed to be buried in the pet cemetery on the abbey grounds, and visitors have apparently found that their animals refuse to pass through the area.
It's interesting. It makes you wonder if they can sense something, perhaps. So in more recent years, paranormal investigations have actually taken place at the abbey, and in July of 2011, the paranormal group Northampton Spirit Seekers investigated Delapre Abbey, and they reported to have seen the apparition of a woman they believed to be the spirit of Mary Bouverie, who was a former resident of the abbey. During the investigation, they also smelled her perfume. But what's even more interesting than that is that they claim to have encountered her twice. Once inside the building, where she appeared as a young woman in her 20s, and once more outside, but seemingly at a much older age. Now, this sounds pretty odd, but there is some logic to it, and it might just make sense. After the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the 1500s, Delapre Abbey started a new chapter of its existence as a family home when it was sold to the Tate family in 1546. But by 1746, the property was sold on again to become the Bouverie Country Estate. And from the timeline I was able to put together, it seems that Mary Bouverie lived at Delapre with her family until financial troubles forced them to rent out the estate to a John Cooper, who was a Northampton boot and shoe manufacturer. But in 1906, John Cooper died, and his family gradually move out, leaving the property empty for a while. During this time, however, Mary has outlived her brother, and she inherits the estate and moves back in 1914, where as far as I can tell, she remained until 1940, when the Abbey was requisitioned by the War Office and they moved her out to Duston. But by 1942, Mary realised that she was coming to the end of her life, and she had one final wish: to return to Delapre so that she could end her days at her childhood home. So she sent for her bailiff and told him that she wanted to die at Delapre. The War Office granted her request. They were prepared rooms in the stable block for her, and she was allowed to move back in. And barely a year later, on the 20th of January 1943, she passed away there.
I'm fascinated by the fact that they saw her at 2 different ages.
I know, it is really interesting.
Now, I've heard of sort of the ghosts of the same person being seen in different places, but I think this is the first time I've ever heard of 2 different ages of the same person being seen at the same place.
I know, it's fascinating, isn't it? But it does, you see what I mean? It kind of makes sense, because in her younger years, she would have spent the majority of her time inside the house when she was living there. But when she moved back, when she was well towards the end of her life, she wasn't living inside the house. She was almost stuck on the outside after having been basically turfed out of her own home by the War Office. I mean, there must be such a deep connection there. She's, for her to have moved out and to feel that pull back to the house to end her days there. You can understand why she might be haunting the place.
Yeah, it obviously shows a strong attraction when she knew that she didn't have long left and she wanted to be there to die. It was almost as if she was sort of cementing her position there.
Absolutely. Absolutely fascinating.
Unfortunately, while we were there, the only places we could actually see were the cafe and the toilet.
Yes, we could see lots of the grounds and the estate itself, which is absolutely beautiful. Some wonderful woodland walks around the area. But the house itself is not currently open to the public, which is a real shame. But we are actually quite lucky to have it at all. After 1948, when the War Office gave up its use of the house and the next inhabitants gradually abandoned the estate, for a time the future of Delapre was in question. It was very nearly demolished. We're very lucky that it was saved at the last minute by the Northamptonshire Record Office, moving themselves into there, and there they remained until 1992. But there are plans to open it up to the public, but as with many of these things, it is all a case of funding. So we can only hope that they get the funding they need, and one day we can go into the house and check out that haunted staircase.
And that nearly brings us to the end of the show, but we do have one more story for you. It's a paranormal blooper that made the news.
I know, I love this so much. There's been a paranormal blooper in the newspapers, and this took place at St Philip and St James Church in Ilfracombe, Devon. Now, a local shopkeeper was walking home midnight on a Friday night. He was walking past his local church when he heard the eerie strains of organ music emanating from the dark and locked up church. Thinking maybe somebody had snuck in there, thinking maybe vandals, thinking maybe intruders, but not yet ghosts, he walks around the church, checking the doors and looking for lights inside, and finds nothing. The church is soundly locked and not a light is showing through the window. So he becomes pretty concerned at this point and calls the police. They come out, they do the walk around the church, they check the doors, they start knocking to see if there's anybody in there and calling out. They've got their torches out. Nothing, no response. The church is dark, the church is locked, but the eerie strains of organ music are still coming out of the church onto the night air. So at this point, getting truly freaked out, they call the vicar, thinking maybe there's something automated in the church. Maybe something's playing. Maybe the organ has an automated function where it just turns itself on. They ring the vicar, they drag him out from his bed. Nope, he says that there's no automated function on the organ. If it's playing, somebody is playing it. At this point, they're wondering how they're going to arrest a ghost because they're still knocking on the door. No response, not a light to be seen. So they have to get the vicar to come out and unlock the church. With trepidation, I imagine, the vicar tentatively unlocks the church and opens the door, and they hear a voice saying, "Hello, vicar. It's only me." I laughed so hard. It was the church organist who had decided, for reasons best known to himself, to go and practice in the church in the middle of the night. And he only had a key to the organ. He didn't have the key which unlocked the light switch cabinet. So he'd been sitting there playing happily along to himself in the dark. And the police said to him, "Why didn't you respond when we were knocking on the door and we were flashing our torches around? What, you didn't say anything." And he said, "Well, I just thought it was youths and vandals messing around, so I ignored it." I thought it was utterly fantastic.
That is brilliant. I would love to have known what was going through the minds of the policemen when they went in. Like, how do we write this one up, Fred?
You can only imagine what was going through their minds.
And that really is all we have time for this episode. Thank you so much to everyone that sent in stories, and if you've had a paranormal encounter, please do get in touch and let us know. Thank you also to our patrons, whose support really is helping us improve the show. And you can also help us by rating and reviewing us on your podcast provider of choice, as well as spreading the word about the show and recommending us to your friends. That is it for this episode, and we hope you'll join us again for some more Knock Once for Yes.
EVP session end.